The battle was over, and the silence that followed was deafening. The once mighty warrior king lay in the dust, his body broken, armor shattered, and his empire in ruins. He had fought valiantly, leading his multi-species forces with the kind of leadership that had once commanded respect across the stars. But in the end, it wasn't the strength of his enemies that brought him down, it was betrayal from within. As he struggled to breathe, every intake of air a sharp reminder of his grievous injuries, he scanned the battlefield for any sign of his allies. There were none. The warrior king's thoughts turned bitter as he realized the truth: he had been left to die. His most trusted commanders, alien races that had once sworn fealty to him, had abandoned him at the moment he needed them most. He had given everything for this empire, united species that were once at war with each other, only to be discarded when his usefulness had run out. He tried to rise, but his body refused. His once mighty frame, capable of leading armies into battle, now lay helpless in the dirt. The ships of his former allies were gone, fading specks in the sky as they retreated from the battlefield. He knew why they had left. In their eyes, his time was over. His injuries were too severe. He was no longer the indomitable leader they followed into countless victories. He was a liability, and liabilities had no place in an empire built on power and dominance. As the realization settled in, the warrior king's pride burned hotter than the pain from his wounds. He had been their ruler, their protector, the one who had unified them under a common banner. Now they left him here, stranded on a desolate planet, assuming he would die slowly, alone. His thoughts were a whirlwind of anger and disbelief. How could they turn their backs on him after everything they had been through? He had bled for them, led them through wars, crushed their enemies. And yet, when it mattered most, they had thrown him aside like refuse. The landscape around him was as lifeless as his chances of survival. Rocky, barren, devoid of anything that could aid him. It was the perfect place for an abandoned king to die. He clenched his fist, a feeble act of defiance against the inevitable. His strength was fading, and he knew that if help didn't arrive soon, his empire would not just be gone, he would be, too. But the warrior king was not one to surrender easily. Even now, with betrayal pressing down on him, he refused to let his enemies, or his so-called allies, win. He would find a way to survive, even if it meant crawling through the dirt for miles. He had always fought against the odds. This time would be no different, even if the fight was against death itself. As hours passed, the king's mind wandered to the very races that had abandoned him. He thought of their cold logic, their calculated decisions. To them, everything was about strength and advantage. The moment they saw him as weak, they had made their choice. It didn't matter how many victories he had led them to, how many enemies he had destroyed. In their eyes, the past meant nothing. Only the present, and in this present, he was expendable. He cursed them all under his breath, but deep down, he understood them. That was how they had always been, pragmatic to a fault. Loyalty had no place in their world. It was a concept that belonged to lesser beings, at least in their view. The warrior king had learned that lesson the hard way. In the haze of his suffering, he could feel the life ebbing from him. Time was running out. His mind, still sharp despite the pain, tried to cling to some hope, some possibility of escape. But there was none. His empire was gone. His allies had forsaken him. And here he lay, a once great ruler now facing death, alone on a planet where no one would ever find him. Or so he thought. The last thing the warrior king expected was a second chance. Yet, even as darkness crept into the edges of his vision, his mind prepared for the end. Something stirred in the distance. They weren't the ones he expected. The king, barely conscious and teetering on the edge of life, could hear distant sounds, voices. But they weren't the guttural tones of the alien races he had once led. They weren't coming back for him. No, these voices were different. Soft yet firm. Human. His foggy mind struggled to comprehend it. What were humans doing out here, on this desolate planet? A group of human explorers, of all beings, stumbled upon him. He felt a surge of indignation. How had it come to this? The mighty warrior king, found in his most vulnerable state by the very species he had once mocked. Humans, in his mind, had always been the weakest of the galactic races. Too soft. Too emotional. They lacked the ruthlessness required to lead, to conquer. And now, they stood over him, discussing how to help. He tried to snarl, to bark at them to leave him to his fate. But his body refused. All he managed was a hoarse whisper, and even that cost him what little strength he had left. The humans, however, did not turn away. They didn't laugh at his predicament, or leave him behind like the others. Instead, they crouched down, inspecting his wounds with concern and speaking in tones filled with empathy. He could feel the hum of their medical equipment as they began tending to his injuries, despite his silent protests. This was not how he had expected to die. And yet he didn't. Against his own pride, against his desire to face death on his terms, the humans refused to let him go. Days passed, though the concept of time became blurry as he drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time he awoke, he saw them working tirelessly. They gave him water, nutrients, patched up his broken body as best they could. His injuries were severe, too much for the humans' simple tools, but their perseverance was relentless. They worked with a quiet determination that bewildered him. Why? Why would they waste their time on him? He had never shown their kind any respect, never regarded them as anything more than insignificant. And yet, here they were, nursing him back from the brink of death. He hated it. His pride screamed at him to push them away, to deny their help. He didn't need humans. He didn't need anyone. And yet, each time he tried to voice his objections, he couldn't find the strength. His body betrayed him, leaving him at their mercy. They asked for nothing. No promises, no loyalty, no repayment. It infuriated him. He had always known relationships to be transactional, alliances formed out of necessity, maintained by power and fear. But these humans didn't seem to operate by those rules. They helped because they wanted to. Because they believed it was the right thing to do. It made no sense to him. How could a species so driven by such irrational ideals survive in a galaxy that rewarded only strength? He watched them in silence as they moved about their camp. Their actions puzzled him. They joked with each other, shared stories, and even seemed to enjoy their time on this barren planet. Their bond was clear, but it wasn't forged through dominance or fear, as he had come to expect from the many species under his rule. Instead, it was built on something deeper, something he couldn't quite grasp. Trust. Loyalty. These were words he had long discarded as naive notions, unworthy of the brutal reality of power. And yet, these humans embodied them. One of the explorers, the leader perhaps, approached him more often than the others. She was a calm presence, asking few questions and offering him space to recover. But her actions spoke volumes. She didn't view him as a dying relic of a bygone empire. To her, he was just another life worth saving. There was no agenda, no hidden motive. Just a simple, undeniable compassion. It was baffling. The days dragged on, and slowly, the warrior king's body began to heal. Not fully, not yet, but enough for him to sit up, to move with some degree of independence. The humans had restored some of his strength, and for that, he hated them even more. It would have been easier to die. Simpler. To let the pain end and his empire's story fade into history. But they had denied him that. Now, he owed them. And that was an even greater burden to bear. Still, despite himself, he began to observe them more closely. Their resilience was something he hadn't expected. They lacked the advanced technology of the species in his former empire, yet they made do with what they had, turning the limited resources at their disposal into tools of survival. Their creativity, their adaptability, it was unlike anything he had seen before. There was strength in them after all, but it was a different kind of strength. One that didn't rely on brute force or superior firepower, but on the ability to endure, to survive in situations where others would falter. He could not understand it. But he began to respect it. The humans, for their part, didn't push him for conversation. They gave him the space he needed to process the situation, to heal at his own pace. And slowly, despite the voice in his head telling him he shouldn't, he began to trust them. Not fully, how could he? But enough to allow their presence without feeling the constant need to guard himself. This was unfamiliar ground for him. He had ruled through fear, maintained his empire with an iron grip. These humans had no fear of him, yet they showed him more loyalty in these few days than any of his alien allies ever had. It was unsettling, but it was also undeniable. Perhaps, in this moment of weakness, he was seeing something he had missed all along. Strength didn't always come from the obvious sources. Power wasn't just about control or domination. Maybe there was something to these humans after all. As he regained more strength, he began to consider his next steps. His empire might be lost, his former allies scattered, but he wasn't dead yet. And as much as his pride had suffered from their abandonment, it had also been bolstered by the realization that not everyone saw him as expendable. Not these humans, at least. For the first time in his life, the warrior king wondered if perhaps, just perhaps, he had underestimated humanity. As the days passed, the warrior king's strength slowly returned. His body, once battered and broken, was healing, and with each passing moment, he found himself observing the humans more closely. What they had lacked in physical power or technological prowess, they made up for with an undeniable persistence. They moved with purpose, even in the smallest tasks, and their camaraderie was something the king had never fully understood in his time as a ruler. In the quiet moments between his recovery, the humans shared stories of their own struggles, the battles they had fought, the hardships they had endured. They spoke of Earth, their home, a planet ravaged by wars, disasters, and challenges they had overcome with sheer determination. It was unlike anything the warrior king had ever heard from any of the alien races he had commanded. The stories were raw, filled with loss, yet brimming with hope. It dawned on him that humanity's greatest strength wasn't in their weapons or numbers, but in their ability to endure the unimaginable. For the first time, he listened, truly listened, to their tales. They weren't conquerors by nature, but survivors. And in that, there was a power far greater than the brute force he had always valued. These humans didn't fight for domination, they fought for each other, for survival, for a future. And that, he realized, was something his empire had never understood. As he watched them, the warrior king felt something unfamiliar stirring within him: respect. These were not the weak creatures he had dismissed in the past. Their strength was quiet, but it was there. Every action they took, every word they spoke, carried a weight of resolve that was foreign to the cold calculations of the alien races he had once allied with. The humans were different. They were driven by something deeper, something that didn't rely on fear or control. He found himself reflecting on his own rule, his past. The alliances he had built were based on power and fear. His empire thrived because he was stronger than those around him, and those who followed him did so out of necessity, not loyalty. The moment he showed weakness, they abandoned him. But these humans? They stayed. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. It was a concept that rattled him. For so long, he had viewed loyalty as something to be commanded, to be demanded. But here, with these humans, loyalty wasn't forced. It was earned. And in their actions, he saw a glimpse of something he had never thought possible: trust without conditions. He didn't speak of these thoughts, of course. Not yet. His pride still held him back, though it was no longer the iron grip it once was. The humans, to their credit, never pushed. They seemed to understand that his silence wasn't hostility anymore, but reflection. They gave him the space to reconcile his old beliefs with this new reality. One evening, as the sun set on the barren planet, the human leader approached him again. She didn't ask him questions. Instead, she sat beside him, looking out over the horizon. After a few moments of silence, she spoke, not about him, but about their mission, their people. She told him how humanity had been overlooked by the greater galactic powers, how they had been seen as insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But instead of letting that break them, it had fueled their desire to prove themselves. They didn't seek to dominate, to conquer like so many other races. They sought respect, a place in the galaxy where they could be recognized for their resilience. The warrior king felt a pang of recognition. He had once felt that same drive, that same desire to prove his worth in a galaxy that had doubted him. He had fought for power, for dominance, to show that he was stronger than anyone else. But these humans weren't fighting for power. They were fighting for something far more profound: dignity, a place where they could belong without having to crush others to get there. It was a revelation that shook him to his core. He spoke then, for the first time in what felt like ages. His voice was hoarse and used, but it carried the weight of someone who had spent too long in silence. He asked the human leader why they had saved him. Why they had gone out of their way to help someone who had nothing to offer them, someone who had once dismissed their entire race as beneath him. Her answer was simple. Because it was the right thing to do. Those words echoed in his mind long after the conversation ended. In all his years of ruling, in all the battles he had fought and the empires he had built, he had never considered such an idea. Doing something not for power, not for gain, but simply because it was right. It was a concept that had no place in the brutal politics of his empire. Yet here, with these humans, it was their guiding principle. The warrior king's thoughts turned inward. He had always believed that strength was the only currency that mattered. His empire had thrived because he was the strongest, the most ruthless. But now, as he sat among these humans, he began to question that belief. Was strength truly the only way to lead? Was power really worth more than loyalty, than trust, than doing what was right? It was a question he had never asked himself before. And now, it wouldn't leave him. The more time he spent with the humans, the more he began to see the value in their way of thinking. They didn't need to rule through fear or force. They ruled through unity, through a bond that was deeper than any alliance he had ever forged. They didn't abandon their own when things got tough. They stood by each other, not out of obligation, but because they believed in something greater than themselves. For the first time in his life, the warrior king understood what it meant to truly lead. It wasn't about commanding armies or conquering planets. It was about earning the trust and loyalty of those around you, about being the kind of leader that people followed not out of fear, but out of respect. And that, more than anything, was the lesson these humans had taught him. The moment of decision came faster than he expected. His body, though still scarred from battle, had regained its strength. But it wasn't just his physical recovery that was complete. Something inside him had shifted. He could no longer ignore the truth that had been creeping into his mind during his time with the humans. Power, in the way he had always understood it, wasn't enough. Not anymore. As the humans prepared to leave the planet, their mission complete, the warrior king made a choice he never thought he'd make. He asked them to stay. Not because he needed them to save him. He was far beyond that. No, this time he wanted them to stand with him, not as rescuers, but as equals. He laid out his plan. His empire, though fractured and scattered, was not yet dead. There were still those who would follow him, who believed in his leadership, but it wouldn't be easy. His former allies, the ones who had betrayed him, had taken control of key territories, claiming them as their own in his absence. They believed him to be either dead or too broken to return. He intended to prove them wrong. The humans, to his surprise, didn't hesitate. They didn't question his motives or ask for assurances. They simply agreed. It was a testament to their character, their unwavering commitment to those they trusted. And though he still found it difficult to admit out loud, the warrior king had come to trust them. He knew now that their loyalty wasn't born from fear or obligation, but from something far more powerful. That loyalty was a force he could no longer deny, nor could he afford to lose. With the humans at his side, the king set his plan into motion. Their small ship was no match for the fleets that now controlled his empire, but that didn't matter. They didn't need brute force to win. The humans, with their ingenuity and unorthodox methods, had a way of turning even the simplest of tools into something effective. He had seen it firsthand during his recovery. They thought differently, acted differently. And in this situation, that difference was exactly what was needed. They struck at night, hitting a communications outpost that had been taken over by one of the alien races that had once served under him. It was a small victory, but a critical one. With control of the outpost, they now had access to information about the current state of the Empire, about who held power and where. More importantly, it sent a message: the warrior king was not dead. He was coming back. Word spread quickly. His enemies reacted with shock and disbelief. They had thought him too broken, too weak to ever pose a threat again. And now, here he was, reclaiming his empire one piece at a time. Some of the alien commanders, those who had profited from his fall, began to panic. They had taken his territories by force, but they knew they couldn't hold them against his strategic mind for long. Still, others prepared for war, determined to hold on to what they had stolen, confident that the fractured remains of his forces would be no match for their armies. But they underestimated the humans. It wasn't their numbers or their weapons that made them formidable. It was their unpredictability, their refusal to give up even when the odds were stacked against them. The humans weren't fighting for territory or power. They were fighting for something deeper, something the alien races could never understand. And that made them dangerous. With the warrior king leading the charge, they began to take back key positions, one after another. Each victory, though small, added to their momentum. And as word spread of the king's return, those who had once served him began to rally to his side. Not out of fear this time, but out of respect. The betrayal that had nearly killed him had not broken him. If anything, it had made him stronger. The final confrontation came sooner than expected. The alien races, realizing that their grip on the Empire was slipping, banded together to make a last stand. They gathered their forces at one of the most strategic locations in the Empire, a fortified planet that had once been the heart of the king's military operations. It was there that they believed they could finally crush him for good, putting an end to his resurgence before it gained more ground. But the warrior king had learned from his time with the humans. He no longer relied solely on brute force and overwhelming strength. His approach was different now, calculated, precise. He led his forces with a clarity of purpose that he hadn't possessed before. And the humans, with their creativity and persistence, played a key role in his strategy. As the battle unfolded, it became clear that the alien races had made a critical mistake. They were fighting as they always had, focused on power, on numbers, on domination. But the king and his human allies fought with something more. They fought with determination, with trust in each other, and with a purpose that went beyond conquest. The alien armies, despite their size, began to falter. Victory was not swift, but it was certain. The alien commanders, realizing their defeat, fled, leaving their forces in disarray. And as the dust settled on the battlefield, the warrior king stood victorious once more. His empire was not what it had been before. It was smaller, more fragile, but it was his again. And this time, it was built on something far stronger than fear. In the aftermath, the humans prepared to leave. Their mission was complete. But as they stood at the edge of the battlefield, ready to return to their own world, the warrior king approached them. He owed them more than just his life. They had shown him a new way, a new understanding of what it meant to lead, to rule. And he wasn't ready to let them go. He offered them a place in his new empire, not as subjects or soldiers, but as allies. True allies. Equals. They had proven their worth to him in ways no other race ever had, and he knew that with them by his side, his empire could thrive once more. It wasn't about power anymore. It was about trust, loyalty, and the kind of strength that could only come from unity. The humans, though surprised by the offer, accepted. Not because they sought power or territory, but because they had come to respect the warrior king as much as he had come to respect them. Together, they would rebuild what had been lost, not through domination, but through cooperation. And so, the warrior king's empire was reborn, not as the cold, fear-driven machine it had once been, but as something new, something stronger. With the humans by his side, he would lead not through fear, but through trust, through loyalty, and through the lessons he had learned in the darkest moments of his life.